Well, this is Melbourne, the day after Friday the 13th, the day that the Australian Grand Prix never happened, the Friday. Not a lot going on there, predictably. There's the Renault merchandise store. Should be huge. Daniel Ricciardo and all that. Should be running today, of course, in normal circumstances, but we're not. A numb feeling in the coffee shop at the hotel this morning. It's always a good place to get a litmus test of what people are thinking and where they're going in their minds. And most people, virtually everybody to whom I spoke, said, as I've been saying, this race should never have been allowed to get this far. I was on record over a month ago saying that they should press pause on the World Championship at that point and think about restarting or starting the 2020 season. I suggested Canada in June because I felt that North America might be a better place to start health-wise than, say, Middle Europe. But at the moment, the talk is that they're going to aim to try and restart or start this championship at Baku at the beginning of June, which is, of course, Central Europe. So we'll see what happens there. For me, the Canadian Grand Prix would have been the right place because we have two Canadians in Formula One, apart from anything else, Nicky Latifi and Lance Stroll. And, you know, by then you would imagine that hopefully there'll be some progress on this whole coronavirus situation. But as I said, most people at the moment, the talk is of how we should never have come this far. It's a long way to fly to Australia, a lot of time traveling, a lot of time, particularly for team personnel, sitting very close to one another, working closely with one another. I should stay right at the start of this, wishing all the best to the McLaren mechanic who got ill pretty much as soon as he arrived and was diagnosed with the virus, and therefore causing McLaren correctly to pull out of the Grand Prix. We now know that on Thursday night, Ferrari was saying there's no way they were going to be racing. So it was just a question after that of how they were going to solve that problem legally. Nobody wanted to blink first, of course. The organisers didn't want to cancel first, and nor did Liberty. So that went on for a while, right through to 10 o'clock yesterday morning, which I thought was a bit ridiculous. A lot of people got to the track as if they were going to be racing, particularly, for example, the FOM TV crews. But it was cancelled at 10 o'clock, no supporting races either. And by that time, the two Ferrari drivers, Max and Lewis, I think were on the way to the airport. So it was all over. It was never going to happen anyway. And as I say, I don't think they should ever have allowed it to get this far for two reasons. One, when the Italian government went into lockdown and basically said only travel for really critical reasons. They've said work reasons, as I said in the other video, but that doesn't make any sense to me. What they probably meant was really critical meetings that you've got to have. At that moment, they should have pressed pause on the Australian Grand Prix, but they didn't. And then even more amazingly, actually, I think, for a country as bureaucratic as Australia, that they then allowed all the Italian teams. I'm not saying that Italy in any way is more to blame or less, but I mean, there's just one example of where it should have stopped. There's no way in the world the Formula One personnel should have been obliged to work shoulder to shoulder in that paddock area on Thursday. And now, you know, by Thursday night, people were saying, people in position of power were saying, well, did anybody shake hands with anybody at McLaren? Did you talk to anybody at McLaren too closely? Did anybody cough? I mean, it was just ridiculous. And you can't expect mechanics working in a Formula One pit lane at a temporary Grand Prix circuit, which of course Albert Park is, not to be close to one another. And that I think is the really poor thing that's happened. Looking to the future, the word is now the first race, probably, they're planning, as I say, to be Baku. I think it should be Canada. I've always campaigned for that, but it may well be Baku. Let's hope that by then everything is looking good. I think there's a big argument to do a championship like the PGA Golf do, where they start after the last big event of any given year, which is in their case the PGA Championship, I think, and then they start their World Championship, if you like, which then straps around the end of the calendar year and finishes around October of the following year. I think that's what Formula One should do. I think we should start a championship in June, and I think we should try and make it work through to June 2021. That has complications, of course. I know all the money men will say, well, Abu Dhabi pay a fortune to be the last round, so how do you figure that? Well, to me, this is a reminder that we should put certain things before money in Formula One. And as much as one respects everybody's right to work and to do things and to be involved in whatever they want to do, as somebody that's been around and watched Formula One and been a part of Formula One, if you like, for 40 years now, I think, and I've said this several times, I think Formula One is actually a bit too big for what it tries to be. And if it does deflate somewhat over these months, I don't think that'll be a bad thing at all. And I think we need to rethink a lot of the way we do things. One thing that springs to mind is that the Australian Grand Prix actually lends itself much more, I think, to be the final round than Abu Dhabi. It's a great country in which to finish the season, as we saw in Adelaide for so many years, and it's a great country for the teams then to stay in. I know there's the financial inducement from Abu Dhabi, but that's just my opinion. I think Australia would be much better at the end of the year. The weather today, for example, it's not very good. Look at that cloud up there, grey cloud, quite cold and windy. We don't come to Australia for that. We come for the Australian summer, and we run much too late in the summer here in Melbourne. I think should be good weather, and there should be a much better atmosphere in that sense. So I'd love to see Melbourne being the last round of any given championship. That's the first thing. Secondly, I go back to something Bernie Ecclestone said to me many years ago, at least 15 years ago, maybe 20, when we were all getting a bit antsy about how tight he was with press credentials, and it was when he was really getting on top of controlling who got the pass and who didn't. And Bernie made the point that although the Formula One World Championship is a world championship, world in italics, we don't necessarily have to stage every race in every country to call it a world championship. And his point was that we could have maybe 3 or 4 circuits only hosting Formula One races, a couple in Europe, maybe one in England, for sure one in England, one in the United States, and maybe one in Asia, and then you stage 2 or 3 races at those circuits. To me, that makes a lot of sense. And there is a precedent for that, of course. Swiss Grand Prix at Dijon in France. Nobody really complained about that at the time, it just happened. So if we did, I don't know, if we looked at Ricard as a good example of a circuit that could probably stage 2 or 3 Grand Prix, different circuit configurations there very easily, and they could be, you could run the Chinese Grand Prix at the Ricard circuit. What Formula One wants from China is the sponsorship money that comes from that. I think it's pretty clear that for countries like China and Bahrain, they're never going to have mega crowds. Formula One's never going to be huge in those countries. So the whole point of having the Chinese on the calendar is not to try to fill all those grandstands and make them look as if they're full and they've got 500,000 spectators. The point is to have the Chinese economy and the Chinese essence in Formula One, and you can do that with a circuit in France. You can have it sponsored by Chinese company. It can be called the Chinese Grand Prix. It may sound outlandish, but I think that's the way to go. That's certainly the way to go to cut costs, and that is something Formula One drastically needs to do. As I say, in America, you could have 2 or 3 races. You could have 2 or 3 races at Austin, and perhaps at other circuits as well. And you could possibly brand one of those, I don't know, an Argentine Grand Prix or a Mexican Grand Prix. No, not Mexico, because Mexico's got a great circuit. We'll keep that in the calendar. And obviously there are certain iconic races like Monaco, which we'll want to keep. But generally speaking, this thing about having to go to that country in order to race and all the costs and expense that go with it, I think, as a result of what we're going through here and the amount of money that is going to be lost because of this virus, I think it's time for Formula One to start rethinking in those ways. Just think about how much money has been lost, I don't know, collectively with the postponement, they're talking about, but probably the cancellation of the Australian Grand Prix this year on every side of the table here. We're talking the organisers, obviously, but I don't know whether they're going to have to pay the fee to the Formula One industry. We'll try and find that out over the next few weeks. The Formula One industry, which potentially is lost for the second time now and will for future races coming up, will lose its income from the circuit organiser, which effectively is a television thing as well. And then, of course, it's the cost of the city of putting up everything they did for that Albert Park circuit. And it's not 20 million that the government basically write off as a tourism event here. It's more than that. And that cost is there because that circuit was built. And that's not cheap. And that's one of the reasons I say this thing should have been stopped a lot sooner, because of the amount of money that has been spent already building the Albert Park circuit. So I think Formula One needs to go through some radical changes, and this is the moment to do it. You know, I was slightly supercilious in a tweet I put out saying that what should have happened is that they should have got paid three or four Formula One drivers to go and do the S5000 race in Melbourne, because the cars were all lined up there. Obviously the teams weren't going to take part in the Grand Prix, but you could have paid, I don't know, $100,000 to a few drivers like Nicholas Latifi, Carlos Sainz, people like that, and they could have come over and done that S5000 race alongside Rubens Barrichello and Giancarlo Fisichella and Jack Aitken, who were doing it anyway. Would have been a bit of fun, and if we got that out on TV, it would have salvaged something from the weekend, but nobody thought laterally to try to do that. I'm sure there are a million legal reasons why that couldn't have happened, but to me, that was an opportunity that kind of was never even considered, and I think it should have been. And on that point, you know, there's so much talk about the 2021 regulations and the budget cap and everything else, but here we are in this really weird twilight zone of the virus now, and postponed or cancelled races, and lots of concerns about the economy of Formula One and where the money's going to be coming from in the future. And I think it's time to really, really have a deep, long think about where we're going with the sport, because on the one side of the coin, we've got the ever-growing importance of electric cars, and Formula One obviously has gone the hybrid route. But how is it going to solve that problem of companies wanting to be associated just with electric cars? That's one thing. My personal view is that Formula One should always be a big show, and we should have had our own Formula E, if you like. But because of the fighting that was going on between John Todd and Bernie Ecclestone, John Todd was left to go off and do Formula E on his own, and Formula One never embraced it. And I think that's one problem. On the other side of the coin, the incredible cost of running a Formula One team, sending it all over the world, designing and building the cars, everything that comes with it. Why don't they neutralize it? Of course you can still have a Ferrari, of course you can still have a Mercedes, but if you want, and I've made this point several times, there should be a template car that the rest of the grid can run. And it should be some sort of Dallara type car. And it should be relatively economic. It should be F2 plus, and I think that's the way forward myself. I think it's too complicated, it's too expensive. 175 million budget cap. I mean, if you really mention that number to some serious Fortune 500 players, they sort of look at you and they look at the cost of sponsoring the Olympics or something like that and the return you get, and you say, oh well, the team's only running on 175 million now, and they just think you're mad. Completely mad. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my opinion.